Hey everyone, we're working hard to get our first 1,000 subscribers, sign up and you won't regret it. I didn't realize you could feel your stomach drop before your brain catches up. 1 second, I was standing in a restaurant packed with people I barely knew, holding a glass of cheap champagne I didn't even want. The next, the entire room was staring at me like I'd just tripped and fallen in slow motion. It was Sabrina's idea to come. Just show your face, she'd said earlier that week, like it was a simple errand. It's a fundraiser. My friends will be there. It matters. Sabrina worked in brand partnerships, which mostly meant her phone never left her hand. I was a project manager for a mid-sized construction outfit, nothing glamorous, but steady. My life was calendars, budgets, weather delays, and arguing with subcontractors about deadlines. Hers was lighting, angles, comments, and pretending everything was effortless. We'd been together a little over 2 years, living in a downtown apartment I couldn't really afford but convinced myself was temporary. The rent was split, technically. In practice, I paid more. Sabrina liked to say she was investing in herself, which was her way of making instability sound ambitious. The fundraiser was hosted at this trendy place with plants hanging from the ceiling and a menu that didn't list prices. Sabrina introduced me to people with quick smiles and eyes that skimmed over me like I was background furniture. At first it was fine. I stayed close, nodded when I had to, laughed when I was supposed to. I told myself I didn't need to fit in with her circle. I wasn't there for them. I was there for her. Then she tapped her glass with a spoon. People turned. Phones came out like it was reflex. Sabrina took the little space in front of the private dining area like it was a stage she'd rehearsed on. She looked perfect, hair done, dress fitted, makeup soft but deliberate. She held her drink and smiled like she was about to say something sweet. She started talking about relationships, about support, about how love should lift you. And the whole time she talked, her eyes kept finding me, then drifting away, then finding me again. Like she was checking to see if I was still standing where she wanted me. It took a few sentences before I realized the support part wasn't praise. It was a setup. She shifted from general to specific. She mentioned someone who thought showing up was enough. Someone who didn't push. Someone who was comfortable being average. I felt heat rise into my face. I glanced around, hoping I was misreading it. People were smiling in that way people do when they think they're watching something brave. Then Sabrina said it, clear as a knife. She turned toward me, lifted her chin like she was doing me a favor, and told the room I wasn't good enough. Not in a teasing way. Not in a private argument that slipped out. Public. Final. Like she'd been waiting for the right lighting. I remember the exact sound the room made afterward. Not laughter. Not gasps. This weird, hungry silence. Like everyone was leaning forward. My first instinct was to say something back. To defend myself. To ask what the hell she was doing. To make it stop. But I looked at her face and I understood something in a flash. She wanted the moment to belong to her. If I reacted, she'd get to frame it. If I argued, I'd be the bitter guy who couldn't handle truth. If I begged, I'd be the weak one. So I didn't give her anything. I set my glass down carefully so my hand wouldn't shake. I didn't look around for witnesses. I didn't storm out. I just turned and walked. Behind me, I heard murmurs start back up, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of people adjusting their opinions in real time. Someone said my name like a question, then stopped. I pushed through the front door and let the cold air hit my face. For a second I couldn't breathe right. My chest felt tight, like my ribs were too small. I stood on the sidewalk watching cars pass, and it felt ridiculous that the world kept moving. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over Sabrina's name. I didn't call. If I called, she'd get to turn it into a fight. A scene. Something she could explain away later with soft words and a curated story. So I walked. I didn't even go home right away. I wandered for blocks with no plan, hands shoved in my pockets, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling into something ugly. Every few minutes, I'd feel the urge to run back and demand an explanation. But what explanation could make that okay? By the time I ended up in my truck, it was late. I sat there with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel like it might tell me how to handle being humiliated by the person who claimed to love me. My phone buzzed. A text from Sabrina. Not an apology. Not even concern. Just something like, "Don't be dramatic. We'll talk later." That's when I knew she wasn't embarrassed. She was satisfied. I drove to a 24-hour grocery store parking lot and sat there under fluorescent lights, watching people push carts like their lives were simple. I checked the time. 11:39 p.m. I don't know why that number stuck with me. Maybe because midnight felt like a line you cross. Then my phone buzzed again. A name I didn't expect, Mara. Mara was one of Sabrina's friends, more grounded than most of them. She'd always been polite to me in a way that felt almost careful, like she was watching for something. Her message was short, and it made my blood go cold. Caleb. I'm so sorry. I didn't know she was going to do that. But you need to see what she's been doing. Can you talk right now? I stared at the screen. My hands went numb. Then another text came through, sent at 11:40 p.m. on the dot. She didn't humiliate you by accident. It was the first step. And you're the one she's planning to blame. And I realized, sitting alone in my truck, that tonight might not have been the end of my relationship. It might have been the beginning of something much worse. I didn't answer Mara right away. Not because I didn't want to. Because I didn't know what to say to a message like that without tipping my mind into panic. I typed, "What do you mean?" Then deleted it. I typed, "Are you serious?" Then deleted it. Finally I just sent, "Call me." My phone rang immediately, like she'd been waiting with her finger hovering over my contact. Mara didn't sound dramatic. That's what scared me. She sounded tired, like she'd already cried and moved past the crying into decision-making. She told me she'd stepped outside the restaurant right after I left. Not to chase me, she said she assumed I wanted space, but because she'd seen Sabrina pull a couple people into a corner with her phone. Mara said she'd watched Sabrina show something on the screen and laugh like she was sharing a joke she'd been saving up. Mara also said she recognized one of the people Sabrina was talking to, a guy named Warren, who worked with Sabrina's father. That name hit like a spark in dry grass. Sabrina's dad, Hal, was one of those consultant types who always sounded like he was doing something important but never explained what it was. He'd been friendly to me in a way that felt strategic. The kind of friendliness that comes with measuring you. Sabrina had always been vague about his work. Finance stuff, she'd call it. Contracts. Mara paused, then told me something I wish I'd never had to hear. She said Sabrina had been talking for weeks about needing to control the narrative with me. Not control in a romantic sense. Control like a legal strategy. Mara said Sabrina had been telling people I was volatile. That I had a temper. That she was afraid of how I'd react when she ended things. I sat in my truck gripping the phone so hard my knuckles hurt. I've never hit anyone in my life. I'm not proud of every argument I've had, but I'm not that guy. Mara kept going. She said Sabrina had been collecting little proof moments. Screenshots of texts taken out of context. Short clips from arguments where only my voice could be heard. Notes she'd written after fights that made her look like a patient victim dealing with an unstable man. Then Mara said the words that made my stomach turn. She's been planning to report you. Report me. To who? For what? Mara didn't fully know. But she knew Sabrina had been talking about a paper trail and how it would make everything clean. Clean. Like scrubbing a counter after spilling something. Mara told me she hadn't believed it at first. Sabrina could be dramatic. Sabrina could exaggerate. But tonight, watching Sabrina do what she did in public, like it was scripted. Mara said it clicked. She needed witnesses, Mara said. She needed people to see you get rejected and then imagine what kind of guy would get rejected like that. She wanted them primed. I swallowed and asked the question I didn't want to ask. Why would she do this? Mara hesitated. Then she said, because of the money. I almost laughed, but it came out wrong. What money? Mara told me to check my email. She said she'd sent something while we were talking. I opened my email with one hand, phone still pressed to my ear. A subject line, FWD, Caleb, urgent. I tapped it. Inside were screenshots. Not random gossip screenshots. Not petty texts. Documents. A shared folder link. A spreadsheet. A series of messages with numbers that made my eyes unfocus. And one screenshot that was a conversation between Sabrina and someone saved as W. The messages were casual, like two people talking about groceries, except they were talking about accounts. About transfers. About timing. And then a line that punched the air out of my lungs. Sabrina, if he pushes back, we do the domestic angle. He'll fold. Mara's voice came through my phone like it was far away. Do you see it? I couldn't speak. I scrolled. More messages. Sabrina talking about joint funds. Talking about getting me to sign something for taxes. Talking about making sure I looked unstable if I questioned it. I remembered little moments from the past few months, Sabrina asking to be added to my bank app, just in case. Sabrina suggesting we open a joint account to make rent easier. Sabrina pushing me to let her handle the bills. I'd told myself it was partnership. Mara said she'd found those screenshots because she'd been helping Sabrina plan content stuff and Sabrina had left her laptop open with a messaging app running. Mara said she'd seen my name and got that instinctive sick feeling that something wasn't right. She'd taken photos with her phone and sent them to herself. Then spent the last hour deciding whether to send them to me. I asked Mara if Sabrina knew. Mara said no. But Sabrina was the kind of person who noticed when something was out of place. Mara told me the most important thing: don't go home and confront her. Not tonight. Because if Sabrina realized I knew, she'd shift gears fast. And if she was already planting the idea that I was volatile, a confrontation was exactly what she wanted. I stared at the screenshots again and felt something settle in me. Not rage. Not sadness. Clarity. This wasn't just a breakup. This was a plan. I asked Mara what she thought Sabrina was trying to do, specifically. Mara said, "I think she's trying to get you to leave the apartment and sign away access to your accounts. And then she'll file something that makes you look dangerous so you can't fight it." My mouth went dry. Because suddenly, the humiliation at the restaurant made sense. Not as cruelty for cruelty's sake. As step one in forcing me into a corner. My phone buzzed, another text from Sabrina. I didn't open it right away. Mara said, "Caleb, you need to protect yourself. Tonight. Now." I looked at the time again. 11:58 p.m. Almost midnight. Almost that line. And for the first time since I walked out of that restaurant, I knew exactly what I had to do next. But it wasn't what my emotions wanted. It was what would keep me alive in the story she was trying to write. The hardest part was pretending. Everything in me wanted to call Sabrina and tell her I knew. To demand an explanation. To make her squirm. But if Mara was right, that urge was the trap. So I did the opposite. I drove to a cheap hotel off the highway and paid for a room with a card Sabrina didn't know existed, an old credit card I'd kept for emergencies. I didn't tell the front desk my real reason for staying. I didn't tell anyone anything. I just locked the door, sat on the bed, and laid out the pieces like I was planning a job. Because I was. First, I took screenshots of Mara's screenshots. I saved them to a cloud folder Sabrina had no access to. Then I forwarded everything to my work email, and then to a second personal email from years ago that Sabrina didn't know about. I wanted copies in multiple places because I'd seen enough movies, and lived enough life, to know that accidents happen when people get desperate. Second, I checked my bank accounts. The joint account Sabrina had convinced me to open had a balance that didn't match what I thought it should. Not wildly off, but off enough to make my stomach tighten. I pulled up the transaction history. Small transfers. Consistent. Almost like someone trying not to trigger alerts. I felt my throat close. I froze the account. Not by canceling it, just by calling the bank's fraud line and telling them I suspected unauthorized access and needed to temporarily lock outgoing transfers. They asked if I wanted to report the joint account holder. I said no. Not yet. Because I didn't want to tip Sabrina off. Third, I called a friend from work, a guy named Julian who'd been through a nasty divorce a few years back. I told him I needed the name of a lawyer and that I needed it fast. Julian didn't ask for details. He just gave me a number and said, "Don't do anything emotional until you've talked to her." At 7:30 a.m., I called the lawyer's office as soon as they opened. I didn't dump my entire life story. I gave the short version: relationship, shared apartment, joint finances, evidence of someone planning to accuse me of something false. The lawyer, Ms. Patel, didn't sound shocked. That also scared me. She told me 3 things immediately. Do not confront Sabrina in private. Do not go back to the apartment alone if you can avoid it. Start documenting everything from this point forward. She asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I said yes. She told me to keep it that way for now. Then she asked me to email the screenshots. Not as photos inside a text. As files. With timestamps if possible. I sent everything. While I was waiting for her to review, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and tried to rewind the last year in my head. I found moments that now looked different. Sabrina asking me to put her name on the lease, for convenience. Sabrina insisting we merge subscriptions, then bills, then, just make it simple. Sabrina getting weirdly interested in what my company did, what clients we worked with, who signed what. There had been a night 2 months earlier where she'd asked, casually, if my company ever worked with private investors. I'd laughed and said I wasn't in that world. She'd smiled like she'd filed the answer away. My phone buzzed again, Sabrina, over and over. I finally opened her messages. They weren't apologetic. They weren't worried. They were irritated. She wanted to know where I'd gone. She said I was embarrassing her by disappearing. She said we needed to talk like adults. I replied with one sentence, "I'm taking space. I'll be back tomorrow to grab some things." It was bland on purpose. The kind of text that didn't give her emotion to work with. A minute later, she wrote back something about how I was proving her point. I didn't respond. That afternoon, Ms. Patel called me back. Her voice was calm but sharper than before. She said the screenshots were serious, especially the line about using a domestic angle. She told me that even if Sabrina hadn't filed anything yet, the fact that she was discussing it mattered. It showed intent. Ms. Patel asked if I had any reason to believe Sabrina had access to my work accounts or company documents. I hesitated. Then I remembered something that made my skin prickle. A week earlier, Sabrina's phone had died and she'd asked to use my laptop to send an email. I'd unlocked it for her because I didn't think. I'd gone to the kitchen to get water. When I came back, she'd already closed the lid and handed it to me with a smile. Ms. Patel told me to inform my employer discreetly, HR and my supervisor, before Sabrina did anything. Not as a dramatic accusation. As a precaution. She said, if someone is trying to weaponize a story, you want the truth on record first. So I did it. I met with my supervisor, a woman named Denise who didn't tolerate nonsense. I told her I was dealing with a personal situation and that someone might attempt to contact the company with false claims. I told her I had legal counsel and evidence. Denise's expression didn't change much, but her eyes went hard. She told me, send what you have to HR. We'll handle it. I walked out of her office feeling like I'd just stepped onto ice that might hold, or might crack. That evening, Mara texted me again. She's asking around about you. She's telling people you stormed out and she's scared you'll do something reckless. I stared at that message for a long time. Because I could see it forming, how she was shaping the story in real time. And then Mara sent one more text that made my stomach drop all over again. Also, Warren was there tonight. He wasn't just listening. He handed Sabrina an envelope. I think this is bigger than you think. I looked at my hotel room door like someone might knock. Bigger than I think. I'd spent the day trying to protect myself from a false accusation and some stolen money. But an envelope? That didn't sound like rent money. That sounded like a transaction. And I suddenly understood, Sabrina hadn't humiliated me because she was careless. She'd done it because she felt safe. Like the plan was already moving. The next morning, I didn't go back to the apartment alone. Julian came with me. He didn't ask a million questions. He just showed up in a hoodie and jeans like we were about to move a couch. I was grateful for that normal energy. Before we went in, Ms. Patel had told me to do two things. Keep the interaction brief and neutral. Record everything I could legally record. I'm not going to turn this into a legal lecture, but I'll say this, know your local laws. I wasn't trying to trap Sabrina. I was trying to protect myself. When we walked into the apartment, Sabrina was already there, sitting at the kitchen island like she'd been waiting in a scene. She looked polished. Not upset. Not embarrassed. She looked like she was about to explain me to myself. She didn't acknowledge Julian at first, which was interesting. Like she didn't like witnesses when she wasn't controlling the room. She started talking about how I'd overreacted, how I'd made her look bad, how I needed to accept feedback. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I just said I was there to pick up clothes and personal items. Her eyes narrowed in that subtle way that meant she wasn't getting the response she wanted. Then she shifted. She said something about how maybe we needed to formalize things, since I was unstable right now. I felt my pulse spike, but I kept my face blank. She pulled out an envelope. The same kind Mara had described. She slid it across the counter like she was doing me a kindness. Inside were papers. Not a breakup letter. Not a lease document. A mutual separation agreement and a statement about finances. It was written to make it look like I was voluntarily walking away from the apartment and agreeing I'd handled shared funds improperly and would repay a certain amount. A certain amount that was almost exactly the total of the small transfers I'd found. She was trying to make me the thief. Sabrina watched my face, waiting for it to crack. I didn't touch the papers. I said, calmly, that I wasn't signing anything. Her voice tightened. She said something about how this was the adult way, and how if I made it difficult, she'd have to protect herself. That phrase, protect herself, landed differently now. Because I'd seen the message where she'd talked about using the domestic angle. I told her I had legal counsel. That was the first time she looked truly unsettled. Just a flicker. Then she recovered and leaned into a softer expression, like she was shifting to a different audience. She said she'd been walking on eggshells with me. Julian shifted his weight beside me. I could feel him restraining himself. Sabrina kept going, talking about how I could get angry, how I could be intense, how she'd been scared. She was building the story right there in the kitchen. I didn't take the bait. I went to the bedroom, packed a bag, grabbed my documents, my laptop, and anything that mattered. When I came back out, Sabrina was on her phone. Not texting. Talking. Her voice had that performative tremble people use when they want something to sound real. I didn't panic. I didn't plead. I looked at Julian, then at Sabrina, and I said I was leaving. As we walked out, Sabrina said something over her shoulder that finally revealed what this had always been. Not love. Not disappointment. Strategy. She said she had people who were ready to support her, and I should think carefully about how hard I wanted to fight. Outside, in the hallway, Julian let out a breath like he'd been holding it the whole time. In the car, my phone buzzed. An email from HR. Subject: external inquiry received, requesting guidance. My chest tightened. I opened it. Sabrina had already contacted my workplace. Not with a claim of theft. Not with a vague complaint. With a formal-sounding message implying I had access to confidential information and was unstable, and that she was concerned about safety and company exposure. It wasn't just personal anymore. She was aiming at my job. And then Ms. Patel called. She said, "This is where the envelope matters." She told me she'd already advised HR to respond through counsel and to preserve everything. She told me that Sabrina's message to the company, combined with the screenshots, painted a clear picture. Sabrina was trying to create leverage. Then Ms. Patel asked me a question I hadn't considered. "Caleb, does Sabrina have any reason to believe your company is connected to her father's work?" And in that moment, everything clicked. A month ago, my company had started bidding on a large redevelopment project, one that involved private funding and multiple shell entities. I'd been proud of it. It could have been a career step. I'd mentioned it at dinner once, casually. Sabrina had smiled and asked a few questions. Too many questions. Ms. Patel said something I'll never forget. "I don't think you were just her boyfriend. I think you were access." Mara later confirmed it in a way that made me feel both sick and oddly relieved. She told me Sabrina had been bragging about being close to someone in construction, someone who could hear things early. Sabrina had framed it like she was networking. But the envelope, the timing, the attempt to paint me as unstable, the stolen transfers. It wasn't random. It was coordinated. Here's the satisfying part, because there is one. Denise and HR didn't fold. They investigated quietly. They traced logins. They reviewed access. They found that a few emails from my account had been forwarded to an external address at odd hours I was asleep. I hadn't done it. Someone using my laptop had. Someone who'd asked to send an email. Within days, my company's legal team contacted law enforcement. Not because of Sabrina's claims, because of the data trail. And once law enforcement got involved, Sabrina's confidence cracked fast. Mara handed over what she had. I handed over everything I had. The bank freeze helped show I was responding like a victim of unauthorized transfers, not a thief trying to cover tracks. Sabrina tried to pivot to tears and misunderstandings. But intent is hard to explain away when your own messages spell it out. The last time I saw Sabrina in person was in a lawyer's office with other adults in the room and paperwork on the table that didn't care about her story. The humiliation she served me in public? It didn't end up defining me. It became evidence. I moved out permanently. I closed every shared account. I changed every password. I got a new lease in a quieter part of town that didn't impress anyone. My life got smaller and calmer in the best way. Weeks later, Mara and I met for coffee. She looked exhausted but lighter. She told me she'd lost friends over this. People who preferred Sabrina's version because it was more exciting. I told Mara she probably saved my life in a different way than people usually mean. The wow twist, if you want to call it that, wasn't that Sabrina humiliated me. It was that she never saw me as a person she loved or even hated. She saw me as a tool. And the moment I stopped reacting like a character in her script, the whole thing collapsed. Sometimes justice isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's paperwork, timestamps, and refusing to play the role someone wrote for you. And honestly, walking away without a word was the first time I did something for myself in that relationship. At 11:40 p.m., Mara's text didn't just warn me. It handed me my way out.